On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, China and the U.S. engaged in constructive trade talks. How are consultations moving along? And falling birth rates in East Asia with more women shunning marriage and motherhood, the social and economic impact.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. After 2 days of constructive face-to-face negotiations in Shanghai this week, China said on Thursday that it started buying more U.S. farm goods. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi also held talks with the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on the sidelines of the ASEAN Foreign Ministers gathering in Bangkok. Take a look at what's happening between China and the United States over the past few days.
2 days of candid, efficient, and constructive talks between China and the U.S. wrapped up on Wednesday in Shanghai, according to China's Ministry of Commerce. The talks are the result of a consensus between Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Donald Trump on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Osaka. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce said the latest talks focused on why negotiations had been suspended in the past and how to proceed in the future. Both sides discussed more Chinese purchases of U.S. farm products, and they agreed to hurdle regulations to make it happen.
Since July the 19th, some Chinese firms have inquired with the U.S. suppliers about new purchases of U.S. farm produce, including soybeans, cotton, pork, and sorghum. And a number of deals have been made in line with market conditions.
A day after the latest round of talks in Shanghai, a meeting between Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was held in Bangkok. Wang said it was an important opportunity for them to communicate and to set things straight with the United States.
Secretary Pompeo made it very clear that neither President Trump nor the U.S. administration has the intention to contain China's development. He also reaffirmed the commitments the U.S. made to the One China policy and the provisions in the 3 Sino-U.S. joint communiques.
Trade talks were resumed 2 months after the last one, and the two sides agreed to work in close consultation with each other. They are preparing for follow-up consultations in Washington in September.
For more on the latest development between China and the United States, particularly during this round of trade talks, let's turn to our panelist in Washington, Jeff Moon, former Assistant Trade Representative for China. Also in Washington, Steve Pruitt, Managing Partner at Watts Partner. And in our Beijing studio, last but not least, Xu Sitao, Chief Economist of Deloitte, China. Welcome, gentlemen, to our program. First, to you, Mr. Moon, how should we understand constructive, this adjective used by both sides after this round of trade talks?
I think constructive here means that it was worthwhile. It's been 3 months since they have met at the working level, so it's useful to check in, but there are no indications that there were significant progress, and they're not in any rush to resume the discussions until next month. I think the reason is basically that both sides are focused on domestic political considerations. The U.S. presidential campaign is well underway here. The Chinese leaders are focusing on the leadership meetings at Beidaihe and the 70th anniversary of the Communist Party on October 1st. And under those circumstances, I don't think that either side is prepared to make any serious concessions, but it's important that they keep talking, and that's what they did.
Mr. Pruitt, according to the statements put out by the U.S. side, the 2 kinds of issues have been mentioned. One is about, look back at what really happened, and the other is about looking forward as to what to talk about and what kinds of agenda. How much do you think, from what we heard from public resources this time, can we be confident about the next stage or round?
On a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being absolute, I would say about a 2 right now.
Okay.
I, for one, don't have very much confidence at all in these talks resulting in any significant agreement. Quite frankly, from day one, this administration has not really entered these talks with a serious agenda. I think many folks who follow trade here have been asking, what are we trying to achieve? And it keeps changing. So the Chinese will never hit a moving target here, and the U.S. continues to move that target.
The lamppost has always been changing. That's very clear from the Chinese side when looking at what the U.S. side is trying to do. It really takes someone with enormous talent in order to nail down what is the real direction and the discussion. But Mr. Xu, if I could ask for your help in this regard, what do you think when Mr. Pruitt said, 1 to 10, it's 2? What about for you?
Oh, I would say much higher, maybe 5 or 6.
To be politically correct?
No.
Really
I
think
when we look at trade talk, clearly this is going to be a slogging, really in the long run. So if you use an analogy of sports, for example, baseball, maybe the second inning, third inning, but I think both parties are becoming a lot more realistic. On the U.S. side, I do think the U.S. administration has been de-emphasizing, for example, national security in the past few months. From China's side, China clearly showing much more willingness to narrow bilateral trade deficit. Just give you some data point. First half of this year, guess what? China's export to the United States pretty much holding steady. U.S. exports to China, or China's imports from the United States, really collapsed, down by almost 30%.
Yeah.
So China actually has lot capacity to increase purchases of U.S. agricultural product.
Well, there are a lot of reasons behind what you call the collapse of U.S. exports to China. The so-called national security issue by the U.S. side is probably one of those reasons as to why some American companies find it so hard to have access to the Chinese market. Putting that aside, Mr. Moon, I also want your number, 1 to 10. What do you say?
I agree with Mr. Pruitt. I think it's about at a 2. I think that both sides' positions have hardened considerably over the past couple months. And as we move, as I said, into the political season, it's going to be much harder for them to soften up.
Talking about political season, that's what exactly I want to ask you about, Mr. Moon. The candidates of the Democratic Party already running their debate, and each were being asked to clarify their policy, whether toward trade or toward the geopolitical issue of China. A lot of them having very mixed signals. Of course, they are only the candidates. They have to clarify what they are thinking, if they are really thinking it in their own deep way. But to you, Mr. Moon, what does it say, a political environment for the current administration to discuss trade? And how do you think Mr. Trump, even as a candidate for the future, will be able to stand out among all when it comes to trade and also issues regarding China?
Well, the night before last, there was a major Democratic debate, and there were a range of views that were expressed. I think from the perspective of the American audience, there are a range of views. From the perspective of a foreign audience, there are very common themes. All of them agree that the United States ought to adopt a tougher trade policy with regard to China. All of them refuse to commit to lower tariffs. So there is a broad consensus. There's a difference in that.
Except one from California, I think.
Well, broadly speaking, there are 2 categories. There's the moderate and the left view. The moderate view really is that we ought to go back to the Trans-Pacific Partnership and work with our allies. The left view is that we ought to introduce elements like human rights and environment into our trade discussions. In the meantime, Trump is saying that he will be tougher than any of the Democratic candidates, which is actually false. Because the Democratic candidates, the moderates that are likely to win, will do what Trump has refused to do, and that is go back to TPP and joint efforts, which are really the most effective way for the U.S. to respond to China on trade.
Now, the Democrats' debate is not the only thing that's happening in the U.S. over the past few days that are making really big news. The other than that is, of course, the Fed interest cuts. Mr. Pruitt, now there are mixed discussions about exactly what it meant and what does it say about the role of Fed for the U.S. Economy. What do you say?
Well, the 25 basis point reduction that the Fed agreed to really is about as weak a cut as you can find. I think it really was in part capitulation to political pressure from President, but more importantly, I think as the Fed chairman indicated, it's more of a correction and an adjustment, and it's probably a one-time occurrence just to get their situation back in line. Politically, though, I think what we're seeing here in the U.S., Trump doesn't really need and probably doesn't want an agreement with the Chinese right now. He's willing to wait. He thinks he can wait out much of this by either giving grants to farmers for their crops that they can't grow, or other market adjustments that they can do with and through existing authority. But right now, I don't think it's in his interest. He doesn't see it in his interest to get an agreement. He may need the Chinese and their refusal, quote unquote, to do a deal as part of his portfolio that he prosecutes during the campaign. So I don't see much of a chance at all of us reaching an agreement. I think for many observers, we've all kind of concluded there's the government speak that we get from the trade representative and the Treasury Secretary, and then there's what we hear from the President. And all of us are trying to interpret which one has real meaning.
Well, as we all know, Mr. Trump is a fan of the 36 strategies coming out of China. I'm not sure whether it's a strategy or tactics he's trying to use this time, but he was accusing China of not trying to go on with the trade discussion and reaching a deal with him because he was saying that China wanted to wait it out until the next term to see who will be the president of the United States. But anyway, let's put those Twitter politics aside and focus on the real thing. Mr. Xu, about that, given the political factor both our panelists from the U.S. talk about, and the Fed interest rate cuts, even though it's minor, but it does show some kind of political pressure Fed is trying to struggle with. So what does that mean to the Chinese? You're not providing strategies for the negotiators from China, but as an economist, what does it say to the Chinese policymakers and those in the business circles?
In the short term, actually, it's a good news for policymakers in China.
Now, when people are telling me today whether it's good or bad,
good or bad, good, bad. Let me just tell you. Okay, in the near term, it means the policy leeway. If you look at the toolbox of Chinese government, now they got more tools, right? So even before the Fed decision yesterday to cut interest rate by 25 basis points, the market is looking beyond that, right? The market basically takes a view. There will be another 25 basis point later this year. So it's not just all driven by political pressure, also just driven by Wall Street, the financial market, right? The yield curve right now is inverse negative. Quite a few central banks in this part of the world have cut interest rate. South Korea, for example, Bank of Indonesia, and Reserve Bank of India has been very aggressive, and central bank in the Philippines. Chinese central bank, People's Bank of China, is unlikely to follow suit, simply because the first half growth is really okay, 6.3%. The policymakers have made this abundantly clear. We really don't want to have another property bubble. So the apartment houses are really shelters, not for speculation. So I think that really means when everyone is cutting interest rate, at least that's giving policymakers in China more leeway.
Want to follow up about that? Confidence is a very important factor in economic development these days in the world. Now, U.S.-China trade negotiations used to be, at least before this round, an important indicator about confidence and people look for when it comes to what level of confidence about the Chinese economy and that of the U.S.
Yeah.
But now it seems as both sides getting much more realistic.
Yeah.
And both sides experience the drama
Right.
Following the last round.
Right.
It seems that people are more realistic. Is that true in terms of the Chinese business community's expectations and in terms of others' understanding about trade negotiations on the Chinese economy?
It is very true. It is very true. On the Chinese side, it's becoming more realistic because from Chinese perspective, all these requests, the laundry list from the United States, maybe some of them are not realistic, but some of them actually are in line with China's reform agenda in the long run, right? And if you look at average tariff in China, we are still much higher than developed countries, around 7%. So there's a scope for China to increase imports.
Now, Mr. Moon, I want to ask
wait,
you. Go ahead,
wait.
Mr. Puig, if you want to add something.
I just wanted to add that it's pretty clear that the Chinese are being much more realistic and paternalistic, if you will, about their view of what's happening in the United States. The moves that they've taken recently, for example, to sign a significant soybean and wheat deal with the Russians, for example, clearly show that they're going to do what they need to do to keep their economy moving and moving forward. So as those kind of things hit our radar screen, one of the concerns I think that's going to continue to arise is what will the markets turn to, not where they are today, and not whether or not they're going to price in future interest rate cuts. Because I think the Fed chair here is digging in his heels, and I think we're headed for some pretty confrontational dialogue, I suspect, at a minimum, here in the United States in the weeks and months ahead.
Very interesting. All the things that are going on right now. Mr. Moon, another question about the U.S.-China negotiation. People used to believe this is trade negotiation and this is economic policy streamline negotiations. But now it seems that this is one of the very few platforms that the U.S. and China are still in direct high-level contact with one another in terms of communication even. So now, Mr. Moon, is it realistic that this trade negotiation would become a platform also for both sides to figure out the bottom line about the coexistence in order to avoid some of the biggest mistakes two sides could make if there were not sufficient communications? Mr. Moon, the nature of this trade negotiation, has it gone deeper than it used to be?
Well, I think it's broadened in ways that are very unhelpful. This is a trade negotiation. It ought to be about trade issues. If it broadens out, then those trade issues are never going to be solved because all kinds of other things can be linked to it. And that's what was done under all previous administrations. We separated out issues because, frankly, there is no issue in the international arena where China and the U.S. are not major players. So if we start raising a variety of other things, then this trade dispute is going to go on forever. And I would push back a little bit on the idea that everything is being pushed into trade, because as we just said in the setup, Pompeo and Wang Yi both met yesterday, and I'm sure they didn't talk about trade. I'm sure they talked about regional issues and other political issues. So there is some separation, but Trump's desire to get leverage propels him to bring in all kinds of unrelated issues. And the more he does that, the less likely we are to reach an efficient process that's going to get us to a deal.
But the issue is, Mr. Puig, that a lot of things from the United States side, at least as we see it, from Beijing, have been put under the category of national security and therefore make all kinds of discussions very unlikely and also very difficult. So, Mr. Puig, it could be regarded, this platform, as one of the very few that is still active, that is still speaking to the public about what's going on between China and the United States, unfortunately.
Well, I would probably, again, disagree with that scenario. I think there's more activity, quite frankly, on the national security side in terms of the discussions around Huawei and the discussions around the defense issues around the South China Sea, the Chinese proposals to build and expand their bases there, and the other interactions in international water, as well as the issues that I'm sure Secretary Pompeo talked about. There's much more activity, and I think much more constructive, to use a word, activity going on that front than there's probably going to be in the short term on trade. I think we've gotten ourselves tied in knots here in the U.S. on trade in general, because while the Chinese situation is our largest, what we're encountering with the Europeans, with the Japanese, with the Venezuelans and others, really kind of puts us in a position where we're fighting too many fights all at the same time. We don't have enough people in place to serve all of those things anyway. So as a result, we can't be everywhere and do everything at the same time.
Mr. Xu, also a realistic question to you about the latest situation. As we said at the very beginning, it's likely to be September next month, the next round. From now toward then, there will be a lot of interactions both sides are willing to do, but the question really is, what are the priorities if you look forward to the next round?
Well, I think the priority is the execution of some of the purchases of agricultural product, energy product. I think this can be done easily.
What about from the U.S. side?
From U.S. side, I think it's important not to use the argument of national security excessively. Actually, we have seen that since the G20 meeting in Osaka. So I think U.S. has changed its stance. I think that's quite helpful. From China's side, really the concrete implementation of better market access, that's very important. Not just what being asked by the U.S., but what China has to do anyway.
Right. Mr. Moon, about the trade, related to the trade, are the fate of the multinationals from around the world. And now we've seen so many news about, what Apple is doing, or might be doing, what Cisco is doing, or might be doing, these kinds of news flying around every day. So, Mr. Moon, do we face a general situation in which a lot of the indicators of the world might be changing as you see it? And what does that say to the potential of U.S.-China trade negotiations near term and also probably mid-term?
Well, I think for multinational companies, they were trying to respond to what appeared to be a temporary situation. And now they face the prospect, I think there's a likelihood that there will not be a deal before the 2020 presidential election in the United States. So they will be moving from short to mid-term planning to long-term planning. Supply chains that could move quickly have probably done so or are actively planning. Now they're going to be looking at longer-term supply chains, more difficult things to do that take a year or two, and people are going to be looking at that process. And I think it's going to be challenging in the short term, because I do not foresee that the environment is going to get any better in September. As a matter of fact, it will probably be worse. As I said, from the Chinese side, leaders are meeting at Beidaihe, and China is preparing for the 70th anniversary of the Communist Party, which is a celebration of China and China's rejuvenation. And accommodating foreign economic interests is not a part of that equation. So Chinese attitudes are going to harden very much in the short term, and we need to hope that beyond that point, the Chinese side will be more accommodative, but we will get deeper into the U.S. political season as well.
The U.S. political season probably is the season that everybody is looking at. It's the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. Before we go, Mr. Puig, also your thoughts Short-term, mid-term, what can we expect?
Well, I see some real problems in effectuating the agricultural purchases that are being discussed right now. If you look at crops like soybeans, for example, we've got forecasts right now that those crops are coming in below production levels from the previous year, which raises serious questions not only about domestic supply, but the availability of crops. Secondly, the fact that the discussion, if you parse the words and what the statement read, in terms of Chinese purchases will be based upon domestic need. The Russian deal that they just signed pretty much, I believe, feeds all of that domestic need. So there's not going to be a whole lot of domestic need to buy. And as far as I'm aware, the last multi-million-ton shipment of soybeans is at sea right now, headed to China. And there are no orders pending right now. So
I see.
We're now looking at the next production year, I think, realistically, for many of the agricultural products that the U.S. could otherwise provide. So it's going to be a rocky road on the ag side, which then creates more problems in terms of the U.S. ability to respond.
Fascinating situation, I have to say, from a news perspective, but certainly a lot of things are changing as we speak. Thank you so much, the three of you, helping us to understand all the latest from your different perspectives. Jeff Moon, Steve Pruitt, Xu Sitao. Thank you so much, gentlemen. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our live program. Falling birth rates in East Asia, with more women having more choices, shunning marriage and motherhood, the social and economic impact, right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, the program coming to you live. In East Asia, the decline of marriage has gradually become a new phenomenon compared to the older generation. More young women in the region prefer to stay single rather than tying the knot as a so-called necessity. They're rejecting traditions of becoming a wife or a mother for various reasons. Before we get down to a discussion about this latest phenomenon in the region, take a look at this.
That's a video clip of South Korea YouTube star Baek Hana's channel Solidarity, which is a platform to talk about dismantling the patriarchy in her country and giving women spaces just for themselves. She's one of a growing and determined group of South Korean women who are rejecting marriage and motherhood. According to the World Bank, South Korea has the lowest birth rate out of all countries in the developed world. In 2010, more than 64% of women in the country believed marriage is a necessity. In 2018, only a little more than 48% agreed. The growing trend is proving a headache for the government, as the economy is bearing the brunt of the declining population. The administration has offered incentives to encourage singles to date, but many young women called such policies tone deaf, since the government failed to fix the lack of legal avenues to ensure career development for mothers and to ease financial burdens in raising children. Similar phenomenon can also be seen in other countries in East Asia. In Japan, TV dramas and movies telling stories of power women are becoming more popular in recent years, and many of Japan's younger generation admire single, elite women. In China, the marriage rate has been declining for 5 consecutive years. It dropped from 9.9 per 1,000 people in 2013 to a 5-year low of 7.2 per 1,000 people in 2018, according to official data. The figures vary in different regions. The more developed regions have lower marriage rates, and people between 20 and 24 years old had the highest record of marriage registrations before 2012, while people between 25 and 29 became the mainstay in the past 2 years. Economic independence, increasing costs of living, and child education are reasons for the downward trend. For today's youth, tying the knot is no longer a necessity, with many enjoying the the single life.
For women in East Asia, traditional society, some would say, to married or not? Probably let's get that question done by our two panelists, Professor Zheng Zhenzhen of the Institute of Population and Labor Economics of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Let's welcome a female guest onto our show. And in Hong Kong, we invited Yoshikazu Kato, who is an adjunct associate professor of Asia Global Institute of University of Hong Kong. I want to welcome you as well as a gentleman, an important party for the discussion. Mr. Kato, I want to ask you this question first. In the Japanese society, things are changing very fast. The role of women as well, their decision-making process too. As a man, how do you see this process?
First of all, now under the Abe administration, now the women's power is empowered, politically, administratively, and socially. Because now, you know, Japan is the most serious aging society. So now we need to empower and stimulate the power of labor market. And under these circumstances, you know, now Japanese women are encouraged to work and encouraged to go outside of the house, unlike previously. So I think now our women, ladies in Japan, now they are less conservative, more open-minded, and more energetic to work and interact with the society. So now there's something changing under the encouraged by politics and some administration and some media's, you know, public opinion. So now this is a kind of trend today.
Ms. Zheng, you know, it's not just in Japan, it's also in South Korea, in China as well. Very interesting, these long time believed to be traditional society are experiencing some of the biggest social changes regarding women's choices. Ms. Zheng.
Well, I think, yes, I agree, this is a choice, but sometimes not voluntary, because there's a lot of options and I should say a lot of competitions. So which one you take as a priority, I think that's an issue. And
what is the competition that you are talking about?
I think the competition of getting educated and getting a good job and getting start a good career. I think there's a lot of choices. So, and on the other hand, the traditional role of men and women inside a family, I think that make women rethinking, are they going to hush into that phenomenon and taking all the, you know, houseworks and while also pursuing their career. So I think that that's a lot of choices they face.
Besides the choices, there are a lot of issues, I guess, women, or whether they're married or not, have to face. For example, if they are having a child, as we talk about the birth rate being going down, what about all the supporting systems they need to have in order to raise this child, whether it's education, Medicare, or other issues? Ms. Zheng, China, you know, 30 years of reform and opening up, certainly that should be congratulated. But on the other hand, there is the issue of lack of social support than compared to earlier, which was a totally different system. So, Ms. Zheng, how much do you think China is realizing this as we see our neighbors, Japan and South Korea, experiencing aging population and aging society? They already forced themselves to take proactive policies regarding all of this. Ms. Zheng.
Well, I think we already realize that disadvantage. However, I think it is too late. We started now. I think you can see there's a lot of promotions on supporting the family, supporting women, but actually it cannot be established one day. We have lost that for a long time to put that into the burden into family only. Now the society need to share that work.
What kind of work do you think the society really need to share from your perspective, Ms. Zheng, very briefly?
I think help the parents to taking care of the,
how to help?
care.
How to help?
Okay, we can make the work time more flexible. For example, and making more opportunities for women they can arrange their work time. Because when we talk to women, I think the highest desire is to have a flexible work time. And so they can arrange time to be with their children and at the same time to pursue a career.
So that's the first thing. What about the second?
I think the second is the share of family labor inside a family. A lot of our traditional families are used to asking women to do this and to do that, and the men to work outside family. So this kind of arrangement, I think, still today exists in a lot of families, not only in China, I believe, in Japan and Korea. And I think that's something I think very in common in those
What about in
societies.
big cities that a lot of women, even coming from the middle class, are concerned about the cost of education for their children and the cost of Medicare for their children as well? Not to mention that there are more and more of them who are the only child of the family, so they have burdens from both generations, the older generation and the younger generation. So how will, a current generation be able to handle all of these moving factors all at the same time? That is a challenge. None have experienced that before.
I think that's a big challenge. I have no clue for that. And because when I talk to my young colleagues, I think they work very hard than me when I taking care of my child. I think I think that's very common, popular, not only in the cities, also in rural areas.
In rural areas, certainly
Yeah.
a lot of them are becoming migrant workers as well.
Yeah,
so
that's
their
right.
schedule is probably even crazier
That's right.
than would they ever imagine. But to you, Mr. Kato, you stayed in China for a long time as a scholar, and you know what's going on here in the modern Chinese society. Meanwhile, Japan experienced very similar things, even though in different ways, back in its decades-old development. But it's trying, at least, making efforts to take care of an aging society. Now, what do you reflect upon, both your Chinese experiences and also the policies made by various governments in East Asia?
I think there are a lot of differences between Japan and China. Japan is go to rich first and get old next. But now China, is still under the somehow underdeveloped society. But now Chinese society is getting aging. So in that situation, getting something different. And actually, I can see now Chinese younger generation why they are reluctant to have kids. I think one thing is the costs, increasing cost in the city. But in this dimension, I think Japan has relatively, softer, resolved to some extent. So now Japan, if Japan's citizen have a kid, actually the government could support, and basically you can deliver your baby freely. And so actually the government is increasingly supporting more to encourage the younger generation to have kids. But the problem is how to empower and improve our kindergartens, and it's this kind of social infrastructure. Otherwise, the women can't work, because they have to take care of their children. So I think now Japan is entering relatively the postmodern stage. You need to, you want to have kids. Actually, around my, generation, actually they want to have kids, and 2 or 3. And I have one brother and one sister. And actually, our generation, basically, same with our elderly generation. We won't have kids, a couple of kids. But what could we motivate it? We need to have some social surroundings and public infrastructure, including kindergarten. And including some support from companies. So this is kind of multidimensional work to do. So our stage is something different with China, but I agree with you. This is a common trend and interest for East Asian countries.
Right. Before we go, we have only 1 minute or less left. Ms. Zheng, to you, interesting thing that Mr. Kato just mentioned, that China is already becoming aging before becoming ultimately rich. So how should policies that you all mentioned can be implemented eventually for every individual in the society, Ms. Zheng? That's a question.
Well, that's a big question. That's a big challenge. Actually, we now have a very big challenge on becoming aging very fast. And at the same time, fertility keeps low, and people getting married later and later. So I think at the two ends, actually, different problem, but one issue. I think social support is very important to help the family solve their, to ease their burdens and to let them fulfill their demand.
I see. Zheng Zhezhen, Yoshikatsu Kato, this is a huge topic, but thank you so much, both of you, for us to understand the complexity of it. Really appreciate it. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine. Check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Good night.